8 $1 bills, soft and creased from a coffee can, laid flat on the counter of the Delwood Feed and Grain, while a boy of maybe 17 counted them twice and then a third time, because he could not believe anyone was paying real money for what she was pointing at. She was pointing at a wire cage in the corner, the one shoved half behind a stack of salt licks, and inside it were 12 rabbits so small and so plain that the boy had already made up his mind to drown them in the creek behind his uncle's place come Sunday. They were runts. Every one of them the leftover of a leftover litter, ears too short, coats the color of dishwater, one with a milky film across a bad eye, and another that limped when it hopped. And the woman who owned the store had told the boy that morning to just be done with them, because nobody in Cold Branch County was going to trade good feed for animals that would never breed true. And here came this girl, quiet as a Sunday afternoon, laying down her $8 and asking for the whole lot. Her name was Maren Ostrand, and she was 22 years old, and she stood there with her hands loose at her sides, looking at those rabbits the way some people look at a river they intend to cross. She did not say much. She rarely did. The boy asked her if she was sure, and she said she was, and he asked her again if she knew they were runts, and she said she knew exactly what they were, and something in the flat plainness of that answer made him stop asking. Behind her, near the register, 2 men who spent most mornings there drinking the free coffee turned to watch, and one of them, a heavy-set landman named Pearl Hascom, who ran near 400 acres of hay ground east of town, said loud enough to carry that he'd seen a lot of foolish spending in his 60 years, but paying money for rabbits that couldn't be sold, ate, or shown was about the top of the pile. She heard him. She did not turn around. She only reached down and lifted the cage by its wire handle and felt the weight of 12 small lives shift and settle. And she carried them out into the cold March light without a word. If you're the kind of person who's ever been told that what you had in your hands wasn't worth the trouble, do me a small favor before we go on. Tap that like button, and down in the comments, tell me the name of the town or city where you're watching from tonight, because I like to know who's out there listening to these. Say it plain, wherever you are. And now let me take you back to that gravel lot, and that girl, and those 12 runts nobody wanted, because what she did with $8 over the next 12 months is a thing folks in Cold Branch County still argue about at that same feed store counter. Maren set the cage on the passenger seat of a truck that had been her grandfather's, a rust-freckled thing that started on the second try if you were patient with it, and she was always patient with it. She drove the 9 miles out of town on the Millhound Road with the heater ticking and the rabbits gone quiet, the way animals get quiet when they've decided to trust the motion, and she watched the fields go by, brown and flattened by winter, fence lines sagging, and she felt the particular loneliness of coming home to a place that no longer had the people in it that made it home. Her grandfather had died the previous November. His name was Edvard Ostrand, and he had raised her more than her own parents had. And when the lawyer read out that the farm and everything on it came to her, the whole family had looked at her with a mix of pity and confusion, because the farm was 40 acres of thin soil, and a house that leaned, and a barn that leaned worse, and nobody could figure why the old man had left it to the granddaughter who'd gone off to the city and come back with nothing to show for it. She had come back not because she had a plan. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. In the honest hours before sleep, she had come back because there was nowhere else that felt like it would hold her, and because the house, for all its leaning, still smelled like her grandfather's pipe and wood smoke and the particular dust of a place that had been lived in hard for 80 years. She had come back in December and spent the winter learning the sounds the house made and reading through the papers her grandfather left, and there were a great many papers, because Edvard Ostrand had been a man who wrote things down. He kept ledgers. He kept notebooks bound with rubber bands. He kept a running record of weather going back 4 decades, and yields and prices, and small observations in a cramped hand that she had to hold up to the window light to read. She read them all winter the way other people read novels, and somewhere in that reading a thing had taken root in her that she could not yet have named, but that pointed her, one cold March morning, toward a wire cage in the corner of the Delwood Feed and Grain. Because among her grandfather's notebooks there was one older than the rest, its cover gone soft as cloth, and in it he had written about rabbits. Not the fat show breeds the county fair prized, not the meat lines the men out east ran in long sheds. He had written about the old hardy stock, the small plain animals that his own mother had kept through the hungry years, the ones that ate what nobody else would eat and lived where nothing else would live and asked for almost nothing and gave back steady. He had written a line she kept coming back to, a line she had underlined herself in pencil the third time she read it. The best stock, he wrote, is the stock that survives being unwanted. She did not fully understand it yet, but she had turned it over so many nights that when she saw those 12 runts shoved behind the salt licks, something in her recognized them, the way you recognize a face from a photograph you've studied. She got them home and she did not rush. That was the first thing anyone who came to know her learned about Maren Ostrand, that she did not rush, that she could stand at a fence and look at an animal for a length of time that made other people uncomfortable, saying nothing, doing nothing, just watching. She stood over that cage in the cold barn for the better part of an hour. That first afternoon, watching how the 12 of them moved, which ones crowded the front and which hung back, which one with the milky eye had learned to find the water by the sound of the others drinking, which limping one had figured out a hopping rhythm that spared its bad leg. She was not sizing them up for slaughter or sale. She was reading them, the way she'd read the notebooks, looking for what the surface hid. And when she was done looking, she did a plain thing. She built them a better pen out of scrap wood and old wire from the barn, up off the ground on legs so the damp couldn't reach them. And she set it where the morning sun would warm it. And she gave them clean bedding and clean water and the coarse weeds and garden trimmings. Her grandfather's book said the old stock thrived on. And then she waited, because everything worth anything, she was beginning to understand, was a matter of waiting done correctly. The waiting was not idle. Through the rest of that March and into April, she worked the way her grandfather had worked, without ceremony, from first light to last, and she kept a notebook of her own, a cheap spiral thing she bought at the drugstore, and in it she began to record the same kinds of things the old man had recorded. Which doe ate best, which one settled quickest, the weather each morning and the temperature in the barn, and how the animals behaved against it. She wrote small and she wrote true, and she did not skip days, and the notebook filled. Pearl Hascom's word had gotten around town, the way words do, and when she went in for supplies, the men at the feed store counter had a way of going quiet and then talking a little too loud about hay prices. And the woman who ran the register, a sharp-eyed widow named Odell Frayne, who knew everyone's business because everyone's business passed through her hands, asked her one morning how the rabbits were coming along, and asked it with just enough of a smile that Maren understood the question was being collected for later retelling. "Fine," Maren said. "They're coming along fine." And Odell said that was good to hear, and wrote something on a pad that was not, Maren suspected, about rabbits. By the end of April, the first of the does had kittened, and Maren stood over the nest box in the gray dawn and counted the small blind bodies buried in fur, and felt something she had not felt since before her grandfather died, which was the sensation of a plan she hadn't known she was making beginning, quietly, to work. The runts, it turned out, bred like the old stock her grandfather described, not enormous litters, not the fast, frantic numbers the meat sheds pushed for, but steady, reliable. Every doe a good mother, every litter surviving, the kits hardy from the first breath and quick to fend, needing none of the coddling and medicine and heat lamps the fancy breeds demanded. She had spent $8 on animals that everyone agreed could never breed true, and here they were, breeding truer than anything in the county, because true, she was learning, did not mean what the men at the feed store thought it meant. True meant surviving what you were given. Her grandfather had written that down 40 years before she was born, and now it was hopping around a scrap wood pen in the April sun, proving him right one small plain life at a time. She did not tell anyone. That was the second thing people came to understand about her, that she let things prove themselves before she spoke of them, that she had no interest in the argument and only in the result. She let May come, and the first litters grow, and she bred the does again, and she kept her notebook, and she began, slowly, to sort the animals the way her grandfather's oldest notebook told her to sort them, keeping back the hardiest of each litter and the best mothers, culling nothing for looks and everything for vigor, building not a prettier rabbit, but a tougher one. Generation stacked on generation the way her grandfather had stacked observations patiently, without shortcut. And it was somewhere in that May, standing in the barn with the smell of clean straw and the small dry sounds of the animals around her, that she understood the shape of the thing she was building, and it frightened her a little with how simple it was. She was not raising rabbits to sell as pets. She was not raising them to show. She was raising them the way her grandfather's mother had raised them through the hungry years, as food that fed itself, meat that cost almost nothing to make, protein that a poor family could keep in a backyard hutch on kitchen scraps and yard weeds and never go hungry through a hard winter. The county was full of hard winters and full of families the hard winters found. She had, without meaning to, inherited an answer to a question the whole county was quietly asking. But she was getting ahead of herself, and she knew it, and she made herself slow down, because the animals were not ready and neither was she. Through June she culled and bred and recorded, and through July, and the heat came down hard the way it does in that country, and she rigged shade cloth over the pens and moved the water to keep it cool and lost not a single animal to the heat, because the old stock, her grandfather's book said, could take heat that killed the fancy breeds outright. And it was true. All of it kept turning out true. By August, she had gone from 12 runts to better than 70 animals, sorted into breeding stock and grow-outs, the pens spread now across a good stretch of the barn's shady side, and she had begun, in her plain, unhurried way, to think about the next step, which was the step that would take her back into town, back into the range of Pearl Hascom's voice and Odell Frain's pad, and she was not looking forward to it. But she had never been the kind to let not looking forward to a thing keep her from doing it. The first person she told was not a person she chose. It was the middle of August, and she'd driven into Delwood for fencing staples, and coming out of the hardware, her arms full, she nearly ran down a man on the sidewalk, and it was Tobin Rusk, who ran the little diner at the end of Main called the Blue Hour, a lean, tired man with flour on his apron who'd gone to school with her mother a lifetime ago. He steadied the boxes in her arms and asked after the farm, and she told him, because he asked plainly and she was tired of holding it, that she was raising rabbits. Meat rabbits, she said, the old hardy kind. And Tobin, who bought his meat from a supplier 2 hours off and paid dear for it and served it to a town that had less and less money to spend on eating out, looked at her the way a man looks at a door he hadn't noticed in a wall he'd walked past 1,000 times. "What do you get for them?" he asked. She told him she hadn't sold any yet. He said, "When you do, I'll buy the first." And that, though neither of them knew it standing on the hot sidewalk with the boxes between them, was the first turn of a wheel that would not stop turning. She dressed out the first animals in early September, and she did it well, because her grandfather's notebooks had told her how, and because she had watched him do it as a child, and her hands remembered more than she expected. She brought Tobin Rusk 6 rabbits, cleaned and cooled and wrapped, on a Tuesday morning before the diner opened, and she stood in his little kitchen while he unwrapped one and turned it in his hands, and she watched his face, and his face was the face of a man who had been paying a fortune for meat that was not as good as this. He asked her the price, and she named it, and it was fair, fair to her and fair to him, priced not to get rich but to keep going. And he paid her in cash from the register and shook her hand and said he'd take that many every week if she could bring them. And could she bring more? She said she could work up to more. She did not promise what she could not yet do. That was another thing about her. She never oversold the animals, and she never oversold herself. And in a county where every man at the feed store counter talked bigger than his acres, that plainness landed on people strangely, made them trust her before they knew why. Tobin put the rabbit on his menu that Friday, braised the old country way with onions and root vegetables and dark gravy, and he did not make a large production of where it came from, only wrote local farm-raised rabbit on the little chalkboard by the door. And the first night he sold out by 7 o'clock, and the second Friday he sold out by 6. And by the third Friday there were people driving in from 2 towns over because word had gotten around, the way it does in that country, not through any advertisement but through one person telling another across a fence or a pew or a gas pump. The gas station out on the highway, run by a talkative young fellow named Cheswick Loam, who knew every car that passed through and made it his business to know their business too, became the place the story spread from, because Cheswick tried the rabbit at the Blue Hour and told everyone who stopped for fuel that the Austrian girl out on Millhound Road was raising something worth the drive. And each person who heard it told 2 more, and Marin, who had spent nothing on making any of this happen, watched a market build itself out of her animals and her patience in other people's mouths. She was selling 40 rabbits a week to the Blue Hour by the middle of October, and she had raised her breeding stock again and built new pens along the whole shady length of the barn, still up off the ground, still catching the morning sun, still cheap scrap wood and salvaged wire, because she saw no reason to borrow money for lumber when the barn was full of it. And it was around then that Pearl Hascom's grandson, a 15-year-old named Ellis, who was more curious than his grandfather and less proud, started showing up at her fence line on his bicycle after school. He did not say much at first. He just watched the way she watched, and after a week of watching he asked if she needed help, and she said she could use a pair of hands on cleaning days, and she paid him fair. And he came 3 afternoons a week, and it was Ellis, more than anyone, who carried the true account of what was happening on that farm back into town, back to the very feed store counter where his grandfather still held forth about the foolishness of paying money for runts. Alec told them, plainly, that the Austrian girl was clearing more from 40 acres of thin ground and a barn full of scrap-wood hutches than some of them cleared off 200 acres of hay, and the men laughed at him the way men laugh at a boy telling them something they don't want to be true. And Pearl told him to quit hanging around out there filling his head, and Ellis, who had his grandfather's stubbornness pointed in a better direction, kept right on going. It was Pearl Hascom who spoke the sentence that Marin would remember longest, and he spoke it in November, almost exactly a year after her grandfather died, on a cold, bright morning at the feed store when she'd come in for supplies and could not avoid him. He was leaning on the counter with his coffee, and he watched her load salt and staples, and he said in a voice pitched for the whole store to hear that he'd give her credit for keeping busy, but that she ought to understand what she really had out there, which was a hobby. And a hobby was a thing that felt like a business right up until the winter it wasn't, and that rabbits and thin ground and a dead man's notebooks added up, in the end, to a whole lot of nothing, and that she'd learn that same as everyone learns it, the hard way. The store went quiet. Odell Frain's pen stopped moving, and Marin, who had learned long ago that you do not win these things by arguing, only settled her supplies in her arms and looked at Pearl for a long, plain moment and said, "We'll see how the winter goes," and walked out. That was all. We'll see how the winter goes. But there was something in the flatness of it, some unhurried certainty, that stayed in the store after she'd gone, and more than one man there found himself thinking about it later than he meant to. The winter went, as it turned out, better than any winter that farm had seen in a decade. Because the thing about the old hardy stock, the thing her grandfather had known and written down, and that the whole county had forgotten, was that it did not slow in the cold the way the fancy breeds did. The does kept kittening through the short dark days. The kits kept surviving. The animals kept turning weeds and scraps and cheap coarse feed into good meat while the snow piled against the barn, and Marin kept driving her grandfather's truck the 9 miles into town twice a week with a bed full of wrapped rabbits, 40, then 50, then 60 a week, and Tobin Rusk kept selling every one, and started buying more to freeze, and mentioned her to a cousin who ran a bigger place in the county seat, and the cousin called, and now there were 2 kitchens buying, then 3. She never once ran an advertisement. She never printed a card. The demand pulled the thing forward the way water pulls downhill, and she let it pull only as fast as she could grow without borrowing, adding pens from barn sand wrap and bred stock she already owned, refusing every temptation to go faster than the animals themselves would allow, because she had read enough of her grandfather's ledgers to know that the men who went broke were almost always the men who had gone fast, and the men who lasted were almost always the men who had gone slow enough to stay standing when the weather turned. By February, the county had begun to change around her without quite noticing it was changing. It started with the families. Word had spread, first through the Blue Hour, and then through the church basements, and the school pickup lines and the long, slow talk at Cheswick Loam's gas pumps, that the Ostrand girl, out on Millhound Road, would sell you not just meat, but breeding pairs, and that a family with a scrap of yard and a handful of dollars could set up a hutch of their own and never buy meat again through a winter. That was a thing that mattered in Cold Branch County, where the mill had closed 11 years back and never reopened, and half the young families were one bad month from the food pantry, and where pride ran deep enough that a great many people would sooner go hungry than take a handout. A breeding pair of hardy rabbits was not a handout. It was a thing you worked, a thing you kept, a thing that gave back what you put in, and it fit the temper of those people the way a good tool fits a hand. So they came out to Millhound Road, one family at a time, in old trucks and older cars, and Marin sold them pairs at a price she kept low on purpose, because her grandfather's book had a line about that too, a line that said, "You do not get rich off hungry people. You get rich off the fact that fed people remember who fed them." And she believed it because he had believed it. And she watched that late winter as hutches began to appear in backyards all across the county. Small plain scrapwood things up off the ground catching the morning sun. Exact small copies of what she had built, spreading outward from her farm like something planted, taking root in ground it liked. She did not charge for the knowing. That was the part that undid people. A family would come for a breeding pair, and she would spend an hour with them at the fence, telling them plainly what to feed and how to keep the pens dry and which kits to hold back and which to cull, giving away for free the thing that had taken her a year and her grandfather a lifetime to learn. And when they asked her why she didn't charge for it, she would say that her grandfather never charged anyone for anything that grew back, and they would not entirely understand her, but they would drive home with their breeding pair in their free hour of knowing, and they would tell everyone they met that the Ostrand girl was the real thing, and the wheel turned faster, and it turned on nothing but her animals and her patience and the plain fact that she was right. It was in March, a full year to the week from the day she'd laid $8 on the feed store counter, that Pearl Hascom came out to Millhound Road. He came alone, in his good truck, and he parked at the end of her drive and got out slow, the way a heavy man in his 60s gets out of a truck, and he stood at the fence looking at the pens the way she had once looked at the runts, in silence, for a long time. She let him look. She did not go to him or fill the quiet with talk. She kept doing what she was doing, which was cleaning the grow-out pens with Alec, his own grandson, working beside her in the March light, and Pearl watched the boy work and watched the animals and watched the neat-filled pens running the whole shady length of the barn, and finally he called her over, and she came, wiping her hands on her jeans and she stood on her side of the fence and he stood on his, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. He did not make a large production of it. That was the thing she respected about him afterward, and the reason she never held the winner's words against him. He did not apologize in so many words, because men like Pearl Hascom do not have those words, but he took off his cap and turned it in his hands, and he said that he'd been wrong, plainly, that he'd looked at those runts and seen nothing, and she'd looked at them and seen this, and that a man who'd farmed 60 years ought to have known better than to tell a young person what the ground could and couldn't do. He said he'd been hearing about her from Alec all winter and hadn't believed a word of it until right now, standing here, looking at it. And then he said the thing he had really driven out to say, which was that he had 400 acres east of town, good bottom ground and outbuildings standing empty, since he'd cut back his hay, and that if she ever wanted to grow bigger than one barn on 40 thin acres could hold, he would rent her the space cheap, or better than cheap, because he'd rather see it doing something than sitting idle. And because, he said, and this was as close as he came to the apology, he'd like to be part of the thing he'd been fool enough to laugh at. She looked at him a long time before she answered, the way she looked at everything, and Ellis had stopped working and was watching the two of them, his grandfather and the girl, on opposite sides of the fence, and the moment held. And then she said no. She said it kindly, but she said it plainly, the way her grandfather would have. She said she was grateful, and that she meant it, but that she was going to grow the same way she'd grown everything else, which was slow, out of what she already had, with no rent to make and no debt to feed, add in a pen when the animals filled the last one and not before. She said that the minute she took on 400 acres, she'd have to farm it like 400 acres, fast and worried and always behind, and that she'd watched her grandfather's ledgers long enough to know that was how the ground took a person, by making them bigger than their patience. Pearl Hascom listened to all of it, and he was quiet a while, and then he put his cap back on, and he said that Edvard Ostrand had been the most stubborn man he'd ever known, and it was plain the trait bred true, and there was something in the way he said it, some rough warmth, that made it the highest thing he could have offered her, and she took it as such. He got in his truck and drove back to town, and he did not stop telling people from that day on that the smartest farmer in Cold Branch County was a 23-year-old girl who ran her whole operation out of one leaning barn and had told him, Pearl Hascom, to keep his 400 acres, and there was pride in the way he told it, the strange, proud pleasure of a man who has been beaten fair and has lived long enough to enjoy it. The spring came on green and wet, and the story of it might have ended there, in Vindication, with the doubter turned and the pens full and the county fed, except that life does not end where the story would like it to, and the thing that Marin had been half expecting all winter came in April, on a soft evening when the light stayed late. Her great-aunt Sedwin came to the farm. Sedwin Ostrand was Edvard's younger sister, and she was 86 years old, and she had lived her whole life on the far side of the county in a house even smaller and leaner than Marin's. And she was the last of that generation, the last person alive who remembered the hungry years firsthand, the last who had eaten the meat off the old Hardy stock as a starving child and lived because of it. Marin had known her only a little, as a distant, severe old woman at funerals, economical in her motion and her speech, wearing the same practical man's coat to every gathering without the least self-consciousness, because she had long ago earned the right to wear whatever kept her warm. But Sedwin had heard, the way everyone had heard, and she had gotten a neighbor to drive her the long way across the county, and she came up the drive slow with a cane and stood at the fence in the late green light and looked at the pens for a long time without a word, and Marin, watching her, understood that she was in the presence of the same silence she had been practicing all year, only older, deeper, the original of which hers was the copy. The old woman looked at the animals a long while, and then she said, "That's the old stock." It was not a question. Marin said it was, that she'd started with 12 runts from the feed store, and bred them up the way Edvard's oldest notebook described, cullin' for vigor, keeping the survivors, building tough instead of pretty. Sedwin nodded slowly and reached a spotted hand through the wire and let one of the does snuffle at her fingers, and she said that she'd know that stock anywhere, that these were the same in every line and habit as the rabbits her mother had kept in the bad years, the ones that had kept the family alive one hard winter after another when there was nothing else, and that she'd thought, when her mother died and the last of them were let go, that she'd never see that particular kind of animal again in this world. She said Edvard had promised their mother, at the end, that he'd keep the stock and the knowing alive, and that he'd tried for a while, and then life had gotten in the way as it does, and the animals had scattered and the notebooks had gone in a drawer, and she'd believed the whole thing lost. And here it was, bred back true out of Runts by a girl who'd never known her great-great-grandmother and had only a soft-covered notebook and a stubborn nature to go on. They sat on the porch after that, the two of them, in the last of the light, and the old woman talked more than she had likely talked in years, because she had found the one person left who would understand what she was telling. She told Marin about the hungry years, the specific texture of them, the winters her mother had counted rabbits the way other women counted money, the way the plain hardy stock had meant the difference between a family that ate and a family that buried a child, the reason her mother had cared nothing for the show breeds and everything for the survivors. And she told Marin the thing that Marin had underlined in pencil without fully understanding, the line about the best stock being the stock that survives being unwanted, and she said their mother had said that not just about rabbits. She'd said it about people too, about the family, about the whole hard-used country they lived in and the hard-used people in it who had been told all their lives, by the mill and the bank and the men with the good bottom ground, that what they had wasn't worth much, and who had survived anyway, the way the Runts survived, by being tougher than anyone gave them credit for. Marin sat with that in the dark a long time after the old woman had gone quiet, and she understood then that she had not inherited a rabbit operation. She had inherited a proof, an argument her family had been making for 100 years without words, an argument she was now making again in scrapwood pens up and down the county, that the overlooked thing is the strong thing, that worth is what survives being unwanted, and that patience will carry you where money and pride and 400 acres of good ground never can. Sedwin Ostrand died 3 weeks later in her sleep in the small lean house on the far side of the county, and Marin was one of the few at the graveside, standing in the wet April grass while the last of that generation went into the ground, and she felt the grief of it settle into her the way weather settles into a barn, and underneath the grief a thing that was not grief, a steadiness, because the knowing had not gone into the ground with the old woman. The knowing was in a soft-covered notebook and a cheap spiral one, in 70 pins along a barn wall and 100 backyard hutches across a county, in the hands of families who would teach their children the way she'd been taught, and it would survive, because it had already survived being unwanted for 100 years, and that, she now understood better than anyone alive, was the one thing it knew how to do. She grew the operation the same way through the following years, slow, out of what she had, adding a pen when the last one filled and never before, and she never took Pearl Hascombe's 400 acres, though she and Pearl became something like friends in the plain way of that country, and Alec finished school and came to work for her full time, and eventually she gave him a share, because her grandfather's book had a line about that too. The Blue Hour never took her rabbit off the menu, and the families never took the hutches out of their yards, and the county, which had been told by every authority that mattered that it was a poor place with nothing left in it, quietly became a place where nobody who was willing to work a hutch went hungry through a winter, and it had happened not through any program or grant or grand design, but through one patient young woman and 12 animals nobody wanted, and $8 from a coffee can. There is a photograph that hangs now in the Delwood Feed and Grain on the wall behind the counter where the free coffee still gets poured, and it is a photograph that Odell Frayne herself insisted on hanging, though she'd once collected gossip about the girl on a notepad. It shows Maren Ostrand standing at her barn on a bright morning with a wire cage in her hand, the same wire cage she carried out of that store all those years ago, only now it's empty and clean and kept for the memory of it, and she is not smiling for the camera because she never much smiled for cameras. She is only looking at it the way she looks at everything, plainly, steadily. A woman who saw worth where the whole county saw nothing, and was proven right, not by argument, but by 12 small lives and the patience to let them prove it. And the men at the counter, when a stranger asks about the picture, will tell the story the way stories get told in that country, one person to another, and they will always end it the same way, with Pearl Hascom's own words, which the old man repeated so many times before he passed, that they became the truest thing anyone ever said about her, that she'd looked at those runts and seen nothing worth nothing, and turned it into the thing that fed them all. So if you've made it this far with me tonight, and if any part of this settled into you the way it settled into that girl on her grandfather's porch, do one thing before you go. Send this story to someone you know who's been told that what they have in their hands isn't worth the trouble, someone who's been looked at the way that boy at the feed store looked at those 12 runts, because they might need to hear that worth is only ever the thing that survives being unwanted. And then come down to the comments and tell me about a time you saw value in something everyone else had written off, or a person who saw it in you when nobody else did, because those are the stories I most want to read. Tell me again where you're watching from, the town or the city or the lonely stretch of road, so I know who's out there in the dark listening. I read every last comment that comes in on these, every one, the way that girl read every notebook her grandfather left, slow and careful and looking for the thing underneath. And wherever you are tonight, I hope you got 12 small unwanted things of your own somewhere close by, and the patience to find out what they're really worth. The comments came in the way they always do, from towns Maren had never heard of and some she had, and Ellis, who kept up her small corner of the internet because she never would herself, printed a few of them out on cheap paper one winter evening and brought them to the barn, and he read them aloud to her while she worked the grow-out pens, and she listened the way she listened to everything, plainly, her hands never stopping. And when he read one from a woman in a mill town 3 states over who said she'd started a backyard hutch after her husband lost his job and had not bought meat in 14 months and was now selling breeding pairs to her neighbors, Maren stopped working for the length of one long breath and looked out the barn door at the winter light. And then she went back to the pens, and she said only that the old woman would have liked to hear that, meaning Sedwin. And Ellis understood that this was as much feeling as she was going to let show, and that it was a great deal. She kept the soft-covered notebook in a drawer in the kitchen, wrapped now in a clean cloth, because the cover had gone from soft to nearly falling apart with handling. And every so often, on the slow evenings, she would take it out and read the cramped hand of a man who'd been dead for years, and a woman who'd been dead for 80, and she would add to it, in her own plain writing, the things she'd learned that they hadn't gotten to write down. Because it seemed to her that a notebook like that was not a finished thing, but a running one, a conversation passed hand to hand across the hungry years, and the fed ones both, and that her job was not to close it, but to keep it open. She wrote down which lines bred toughest in the wet springs, and which mothers reared best in the hard cold, and she wrote down the names of the families who'd taken pairs and made a go of it, because her grandfather had kept records of people too. She'd noticed, not just animals, as though he'd understood that a farm was finally a thing you did among other people and not apart from them. Pearl Hascom's 400 acres never became hers, but a strange thing happened with them all the same, because in his last years the old man, who had no more use for hay than he'd had before, began quietly renting parcels of that good bottom ground to some of the very families who'd started hutches off Maren's stock, letting them grow the coarse feed crops the rabbits thrived on, charging them next to nothing, saying to anyone who asked that he'd rather see it feeding people than sitting idle, which was the same thing he'd said to Marin at the fence that March morning. And she noticed that he'd taken her refusal and turned it into his own kind of yes. And she never told him she'd noticed because that was not how the two of them talked, but she thought of it often after he was gone. He went the way the old ones in that country tend to go, in the cold, between one winter and the next, and at his funeral it was standing room in the little church because a man who farmed 60 years in one place knows everybody, and Marin sat near the back in her work coat and did not speak. But afterward Alec stood up, 15 no longer, but a grown man with his grandfather's stubbornness pointed the right way, and he told the story of the Runts and the $8 and the 400 acres refused, and he told the part his grandfather had told 100 times, and the church laughed the good soft laugh of people remembering someone true, and Marin looked at her hands in her lap and let it wash over her, the whole warm inherited weight of it, and the wire cage still hangs on the barn wall, empty and clean, catching the changing light through the seasons, the way the notebook catches the reading, and now and again a young person comes up the Millhound Road, sent by someone who was sent by someone, standing at the fence not saying much, looking at the pins the way she once looked at 12 runts shoved behind the salt licks, and Marin comes out wiping her hands on her jeans and stands on her side of the wire, and she lets the silence run as long as it needs to, and then she starts to tell them plainly, for free, everything that took 100 years to learn because worth, she has come to believe past all argument, is only ever the thing that survives being unwanted, and the way you keep it alive is you hand it on, one patient pair at a time, to whoever has the eyes to see it and the stubbornness to wait.